Hi, this is Adam Jones. I'm the COO at SimulTrans, the language translation and software localization company. Often clients ask us, how long does it take to complete a localization project? So we've put together this short video to answer the question. The initial answer is, of course, it varies. We see some projects that are finished in less than a day, while others take a year or more. Generally, a smaller project might take something like 3 to 5 days, and a more complex project usually has a maximum schedule of about 3 to 4 months. We generally find that time frame fits with release cycles and is about the longest that a company is willing to take to complete a localization. A number of factors go into scheduling. Of course, the scope of work is the most important of those, and since translation is largely based on the number of words, the word count is the biggest factor in the schedule. Also coming into play are the target languages. Some languages can be translated more quickly than others, the complexity of the text, and then the formatting, engineering, and testing requirements. It's also important to look at the project plan and see where localization fits in and what is the target release date. That'll help determine the number of translators that should be assigned to the project, and also affect the setup time and the size of the production team. There's always a balance between having fewer translators, which will mean greater consistency, and more translators, which would help accommodate a shorter schedule. Of course, it would always be preferential to have just one translator working on every single word, since that would ensure the best consistency, but that's often not realistic. So usually there are teams of translators that work together to complete an assignment, allowing the schedule to be accelerated. Usually one translator translates about 2,000 words a day for European languages, and that's a word count based on generally running texts that you would find in documentation or online help or longer messages in software like error messages. Usually shorter software strings, the type you might find in menus and dialog boxes, take a bit longer to translate, often going at about half of this speed, since the translator needs to do some research to ensure that he or she understands the context of the terms in the software. Asian languages also go a bit more slowly. Usually a translator focusing on an Asian language would translate about 1,500 words a day. It's generally slower because to input an Asian language in the computer, you need to use an input method editor, which just makes it longer to type the characters than what you would see for a Roman language. After translation, usually the text would go through 2 rounds of review, a technical review ensuring the terminology is correct, and a linguistic review looking more at things like style, spelling, and grammar. A team of reviewers is usually going to review about 6,000 words per day, and they usually would work in tandem, so that first it would go through the technical review and then the linguistic review. So one ideal translation team structure, if you're translating for French, for example, you might have 3 translators working on a project, and then one team of reviewers would be able to review the work of all 3 of those translators. For Asian languages, you might assign 4 translators, for example for Japanese, and then have one team of reviewers review all of their work. And of course these teams can be replicated for many more languages, and generally adding additional languages does not add time to the schedule since the languages are translated simultaneously. So whether you have 1 or 2 or 20 or 30 languages, the time frame is going to be similar. With a team structure like this, you would generally see translating about 6,000 words per day per language. After the translation's completed, there are a number of additional steps that need to happen in order for the software or documentation to be ready to deliver to customers. Often there's engineering involved, which might include resizing dialog boxes, assigning shortcut keys, or building the software. On average, we see that takes about 8 minutes per dialog, or for browser-based software per screen. Then there's usually some testing time required to make sure that the software works correctly and also linguistically that the terms are correct in context. And that often depends on the amount of testing time required for the English product to do a UI pass. It's usually not a full functionality test, but generally a higher level test to at least touch every part of the user interface and confirm that the localized components are correct. And then finally, for documentation, there's usually a formatting cycle, and that's where we would need to clean up the documents in FrameMaker or InDesign to ensure that they look correct, import any screen captures from the localized product, change any graphics, and adjust the styles appropriately. Generally, that averages about 8 minutes per page, plus usually some extra time for screen captures. Here's an example of a sample schedule in Microsoft Project. You can see here that generally there's some setup steps like project evaluation and pre-production, where you might be providing training to the translators on the product so they understand the context of terminology, building a team, having a kickoff meeting, and doing other preparatory steps like those. There would generally then be the software localization step first, followed by help localization, and finally the documentation translation. Of course, a document translation project would not have the software and help steps, but would still follow a similar type of schedule to be completed. And you can see here that a number of steps are overlapped, and that allows you to compress the schedule and make it easier to meet your target release date. In order to estimate timeframes for projects, here's some ballpark numbers you can use as a rule of thumb. Of course, every project's unique and really needs a specific schedule created for it, but if you're just trying to figure out for a general planning purpose how long localization might require, for a simple project you can take the word count, divide it by 1,000 words, and then usually add 2 days for setup and completion activities. So say you had a project with 3,000 words, that would take about 3 days for the translation, 2 days for the setup and completion activities, and that's going to equal 5 days. And the reason you would use this lower number of words per day would be to incorporate some of those other tasks we talked about, like the formatting, engineering, and testing. A more complex project, you would take the word count, divide it by 4,000 words, and then add 5 days for setup and completion. So that would take about 25 days if you had a project of 80,000 words. There are also some strategies you can use to accelerate localization. Of course, starting sooner is always an option. You can try to do translation before your English document or product is complete. Overlap steps in the schedule. Create a bigger team by adding more translators, testers, engineers, formatters, and anyone else working on the assignment. Make sure your client reviewers in the target country are aware that their tasks are coming. That's often an area of delay in schedules because reviewers often have other responsibilities, whether it be sales or marketing or technical support, so sometimes they're not that quick to get to the review. So it's good to notify them early that that'll be happening. Make sure to check the software early for any internationalization or build issues so those can be corrected while the translation's going on. And then while this isn't a sales presentation, I also encourage you to work with SimulTrans as a way to get your project done quickly. We're very fast and very accustomed to doing simultaneous release. There are also some things you should not do to accelerate the schedule. It's very important to have those review steps of the technical review and linguistic review, so don't eliminate those to speed up the schedule. You also don't want to translate the user interface too quickly because that might lead to problems with the context of the terminology. It's good to allow translators to have that extra time to make sure they fully understand where those software strings are going to appear in the product. And then finally, don't add countless reviewers. Of course, you can have multiple teams of reviewers. Some projects I see have 20 or 30 translators, so obviously need more than one team of reviewer per language. But generally, you want to be clever in how you add those and make sure that you do some things so that all the text does get reviewed by multiple people to encourage some consistency. So that gets through our presentation today. Certainly if you have any questions about scheduling localization projects or any other localization topic, you're welcome to contact me or any of my colleagues at SimulTrans. You can see my contact information on the screen, including my direct phone number and email address. Thanks.